Hello and welcome to today's class on understanding geography with diagrams. Today we'll be talking and discussing about the demographic transition model. Now let's start. See, demographic transition model is also called the vital revolution form. It's one of the most utilized, analyzed and manipulated demographic model. This model takes into consideration the temporal transition of fertility, mortality, and thus the total population in any given area. Now, this is the basic introduction to the demographic transition model. Please understand this temporal means nothing but time. Two things again, we also have a spatial. This again, spatial is nothing but your space. So temporal is time and spaces, and spatial is space. So demographic transition model is nothing but analysis of this demographic model or the analysis of the population on the time pattern. Now, basically I want you to start it from here itself. Now this model was basically propounded by two scholars. One was Thompson and another one was Notenstein. Notenstein spelling is Notenstein. Next, based on this demographic experience upon the European countries. So Thompson and Notenstein, they basically built up or they basically propounded this demographic transition model, but this was completely based on the analysis of the European countries. Now, this model incorporates three assumptions. These are the three basic assumptions upon which this complete model has been developed. First is that both fertility and mortality changes from high level to low level in a regular temporal sequence or a regular time sequence. You can say anything about it. What does the statement means? The statement means simply that fertility is nothing but the number of births given by the women during the fertile period, and mortality is nothing but the number of deaths. It says that both fertility and mortality, they move from high level to the low level. Second is the decline in mortality is registered much prior to the decline in fertility. It says that the decline in the mortality is registered quite earlier than the decline in fertility. This will understand very clearly with the discussion of the model. Next, the transition from the high rate to the low rate also involves the transition in the socio-economic setup of the country. That is, a transition from the low income to middle income and finally a high income nation respectively. Next, Thompson and Notenstein, what they did was that they divided the process of transition into the three stages. But it was Sachs who divided the transition into the four stage. That is high stationary, early expanding, late expanding and low stationary. It was in the year 1970 that Peter Haggett is one of the scholars and we'll read more about him as we move on with the models in the geography. What he did was that he incorporated the predictive component to the transition period, making the theory involve five stages. See, basically, if you look into your this seventh Majid Hussain, that is models in geography, you will basically find that there are only how many stages? Only four stages that have been described. But in actual, it has been incorporated. Five stages have been incorporated. So this notes have been modified. Now, let us understand this. See, this is your population, this is your x-axis and this is your y-axis. In the y-axis we have represented time and x-axis we have represented population. The red line is nothing but your mortality, the green line is nothing but your fertility. The first stage is called the high stationary or the early European. Second stage is called the early expanding or the industrial European. Third stage is called the late expanding or the modern European. Fourth stage is low stationary, and last but not the least is your declining stage. Now let's begin with the first stage. The first stage is also called as the high stationary or the early European. Now, as we have already seen in the first stage itself, this is your first stage. You can see that the mortality as well as fertility almost remains constant. But however, there is a fluctuation in your mortality. Now let us understand why. Now this demographic stage corresponds to high fertility. Yes, there is high fertility with fluctuating high mortality. Now, why there is fluctuating high mortality? The reason being, the prevailing high mortality corresponds to the lower life expectancy, yes, the life expectancy of the people during this phase or during this time was quite low because of the prevailing epidemic diseases, etc. And there is a high infant mortality rate. What is this infant mortality rate? It's nothing but the number of deaths of the infant between the age of 0 to 1 year per 1000 live births. Next, again in this stage, the demographic stage, the total population remains stationary, means stable, means there is no increase in population or there is no decrease in population. I hope you got that because of the high fertility rate. Means the fertility rate is also high as well as the mortality rate is also fluctuating. It says that fluctuating high mortality rate. Hence, this stage in the present context, if we talk about this stage, is being experienced largely by your primitive fourth world communities. Simple. What are these primitive fourth world communities? It's nothing but your tribal communities. We can look at over here. This is nothing but your it's in your Amazon. Again, we have over here your pygmies in the Congo. We have the Maasais in Kalahari, and none other than we have the Sentinelese in Andaman. These are some of the examples that I have given. Now, even I have written it over here. Please, you do not need to draw this diagram, and writing only the primitive fourth world community would be more than enough for the examiner to understand that you have done this. But this entirely is to explain you about it. Now let's move on to the stage 2. The stage 2 is called as the early expanding or the industrial European. Now this stage is marked by the decline in mortality. Look at the stage. In this stage, this red represents the mortality and the green represents your fertility. So basically in this stage, what you see is that the mortality has declined, but the fertility remained constant. Why the mortality has been declined? The mortality has been declined because of the advancement in the medical support system. Hence, it is in this stage that the constant declining mortality that we have represented at this, and with the fertility remaining stable like this, leads to the population explosion. What is population explosion? It's nothing but the exponential growth in their population. Now, most of the countries undergoing this stage have a CBR. What is this? CBR means crude birth rate. How do we describe crude birth rate? It's nothing but the number of births per thousand population, and that it to be more than 40. Remember that all the countries that are undergoing the stage 2 have a CBR or the crude birth rate of more than 40, which is greater than the global average of 27 as per the UN population table 2010 to 2011. Countries like Afghanistan, Somalia, Niger, Yemen, etc. are going through this stage. Next, in terms of fertility rate, now what is this fertility rate? Is again we have discussed that average number of children given birth by the female in her reproductive age. Reproductive age basically is the stage before the menopause. Next, and that stands at 4.5, which is above the replacement level. Now, as we move on, I'll make you understand that what this replacement level is. So basically, you understood what the fertility rate is, and the fertility rate standing at 4.5 means the females have a greater reproductive fertility. Basically, the fertility rate remains high if there is a constant prevalence of child marriage. Remember this. This is the very reason that the Indian government has been discouraging child marriage since the British time, because if more number of child marriages, then the fertility rate will remain high of the female, hence more number of births. Next, we have the stage 3. The stage 3 is called as the late expanding or the modern European. The notes is little bit blurred, but please listen to me very carefully. Now this stage represents the begin in the decline of the fertility rate. What did we see in the stage 2? There was decline only in the mortality, but fertility remained constant. But in this stage, what is happening is that both your fertility and mortality have declined. Mortality declines further, but there is also decline in your fertility. Hence, what happens that there is decrease in the growth rate. Please understand this, the growth rate of the population. Though what I want to explain is that though the population increases, but the growth rate of the population decreases. Means if the population growth rate was 10, it becomes 5. But again, if the population growth rate is also 5, the population is increasing, but the growth rate has declined. Next, this stage is experienced by most Asia, Latin America, along with the North African countries with South Africa. In accordance to 2010 to 2011 population table of the UN, I haven't written this, but please mention this. All these regions are not just having the moderate level of the crude birth rate, that is 20 to 40 live births, but also represents the fertility rate, which is range of 2.5 to 4.5, depicting growing population but with stability. Hence, what we see is that though population is growing, but that is growing with a stability. This I have basically represented to show that both the fertility and the mortality is declining. Let's move on to stage 4. The stage 4 is called the low stationary stage. Now this stage again represents the lower level of both fertility and mortality. Now in stage 3 what we saw is that though the fertility and mortality means there is a big difference between the fertility and mortality, but both have declined. But again over here in the 4th stage what happens that both fertility and mortality both decline to means they're almost at the similar level. Hence what happens is that thus making the total population in their completely stable or near stability, that the complete population is brought to near stability into it. And hence what happens, it is the beginning experience not just by the developed countries, that is the but the sorry it is being experienced not just by the developed new world. What do we mean by developed new world? This developed new world is nothing but your US and Canada, which started their demographic cycle slightly later than the European countries, but also by successful antinatalist countries which completely skipped out the stages of the demographic cycle, such as the China. What China actually did was that, see, we have already said that there were 5 stages, but China went on the first stage, second stage, but China totally moved out of this third stage because of its one child policy, and it directly jumped to the 4th stage. Next. Hence, apart from China, we have the Kazakhstan, we have the Turkey, we have the Uruguay that have done such. Next. Let's move on to the stage 5. The stage 5 is nothing but the declining population stage. It was also included in the predictive component in the original model. In this stage, the declining fertility declines below the mortality, making the total fertility decline. Means what happens is that, see, basically in every stage we saw that the fertility was higher than the mortality. But in this stage what happens is that the complete fertility has declined and it is below the mortality, as a result of which it is below the replacement level of 1.8. And in such stage what happens is that it is very difficult to replace this population, and such is occurring none other than in your European nations. Now in this model a causative component was added. The causative component is what? If the causative component is nothing but it says that what actually that that basically that different countries, see, if we look at India, if we look at China, if we look at the Europe, each country is facing different stages of your demographic transition. Hence what happens is that they basically said that why they are facing such condition. So basically Trivartha and Chung, they were the two great scholars who said that the basic reasons why they are having such a transition is because of the biological and cultural factor. No, the biological factor is same throughout the all world, but again it is the cultural factor. What is this cultural factor? Economic growth. It says that with the greater the economic growth, what happens is that your fertility actually declines and the population declines. Let us take the example of Japan, highly developed country, hence it also has a lower population. Again look at Germany, again we look at France, again we look at the USA. Now what is the merit? The merit is that the transition model helps in understanding the transition process of a country. This is number one. Yes, the transition process means in what stages are they moving. And second, it effectively portrays the world demographic history at the macro level generalization. Now, what are the demerits? The first demerit was this empirical observation is based upon Europe, Anglo-America and Australia. The socio-cultural and economic condition of this country are different from those of the developing countries like India and China, and therefore what is true in the case of developed countries may not be true in the case of developing countries. It's very simple and self-explanatory. Again, it was the Loschke and the Wildcross what they asserted that the demographic transition model is neither predictive. Predictive means it says that we are making a prediction. If you're going from the first stage, you'll go to second stage, you'll go to third stage and fourth stage. This is not predictive. Why? Because it was the reason for the China. Like we had discussed, China directly entered into the fourth stage. It did not even go into the third stage. India is going in the third stage and it will go to the fourth stage. But China never went into the third stage and it directly jumped into the fourth stage through its one child policy. Next, the role of man's technical innovation, which can be underrated, particularly in the field of medicine, which can erase the rate of mortality. Now, it says that the role of man's innovation cannot be underrated. We say that how far that man can innovate, and this we cannot means we cannot derate it. Means we have to take this into consideration, especially in the field of medicine, which can erase the rate of mortality. This has also not been given significant consideration. With this, I would end the class. Thank you.